I didn't know if you have questions about it, if you want to review a little bit of it, or if you got what you think you needed to get out of it. You're good.
I actually have a question because I feel like it's funny. I feel like all of a sudden I'm having all of these hypermobile people to me too. And I'm figuring out trying to figure out what works best. And I hadn't thought about that idea of getting the small muscles activated, like when you were talking about the shoulder, in order to kind of allow the other bigger muscles to release a little bit. So I think I was just wondering about that as kind of as a strategy for working with hypermobile people, maybe in other parts of the body as well.
Yes, sorry, I'm just gonna okay. Yes, that is a great question. I think, and it's not just limited to hypermobile people. I think what you'll find is that that's actually true across the board. So if you want to stabilize a joint, it's the small stabilizing muscles that you have to go after. And those are the really, I try and explain to my clients, especially the athletic kind, I try and explain, say, this is the really boring, dull, tedious work that you need to get done in order for things to work the way they're supposed to work. Because it's just so much easier when you're in that pattern to take over with those bigger muscles. So in a hypermobile person, it's particularly true. And so I can stabilize a joint by activating the stabilizing muscles surrounding that joint. And in somebody who's hypermobile, it's not always that they're weak. It's sometimes that they can't access them because the joint's not placed properly, or the bigger muscles is so strong that and the joint's so loose that they actually displace the joint. So firing up, in Jill's case, which we saw last week, firing up her rotator cuff muscles actually helped the humeral head sit in the right position, and then she had that full range of motion. And it's really obvious in somebody like that who had a very mild subluxation of the shoulders, basically what happened. And all we did was internal, external. She's the external rotation that she felt the best in, and then a little biceps. And she's like, oh, now I can move my shoulder around again. Because the muscles are there, and it's not that they're necessarily weak. It's that the other muscles are so big, and there's gravity, and they pull, her joints are so loose that they pull her joint out of position. And so just firing those up will make that difference for her.
I think too, Chris, what Zeina was talking to me last time I saw her too was, I'm having this kind of instability, lower back pain. And it's not just that things can be weak, it's that things can start to grip. So for example, for me on my left side, the QL and the psoas have kind of decided to tighten such that I can't they've decided to do the work that isn't really what I'd like them to do. And I almost can't get around. So it's like I'm loose, but you know what I mean? Like there's certain things that are holding on because I'm loose. So it's like it's so complicated in these layers of what's weak, what's strong, what's tight, what's loose, kind of thing. Cause it's not like everything necessarily is loose.
Right.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Can I ask?
Is that right, Zeina? Is that right,
Yeah.
Zeina?
Yes, the joints are loose, not necessarily the muscles may be holding. And we've talked about that. So in Anna's case, particularly, she had hip dysfunction on both sides. So the hip joints, they didn't know what the heck to do. And they probably didn't even know where they were half the time in space. And so she decided, not her, but her brain decided that, oh, I have a good strategy for this. I'll just tighten QL, pull that hip up, and I'll tighten psoas. We can really pack that hip in there with these muscles, which is not a terrible strategy if it's mild. So for example, if I will use myself, which is maybe not the best example, but I'll use myself. If I have a massage, I tell a massage therapist, do not release my overly tight piriformis on both sides. Because if you do that, my sacrum will just come out of position and I will lose a leg out the room, the next time I try and walk. And not very many people understand that. I have really tight, if you were to see me in figure 4 or try and do a pigeon pose, I'll dislocate my knee and my SI joint before I can stretch my piriformis, right? But if I stretch that piriformis, it doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt too much at all. I don't have pain. I don't have dysfunction. But if I actually get and stretch that piriformis, then I can't hold my sacrum together anymore because my ligaments back there don't work. They're way too long. They don't do the job of holding it steady. So in a hypermobile person, there may be tight muscles that are not dysfunctional, not dysfunctionally tight. So if Anna had just had a little mild hip thing, her body might not have decided to grip so much that it was dysfunctional, preventing motion, creating problems on the other side higher up. And also, if it had been kind of a mild thing, she might have been okay with a little tightness. And she may always have a little tightness in QL and psoas, which would be okay if it wasn't dysfunctional or painful or stopping other things or stopping proper motion. I hope that makes sense. Yeah.
Can I ask one more question? Because this is a little bit of a setting, so I'm sorry if it goes in a different direction, but I did a technique, a training in a movement technique that's based in African dance, and it is based on moving the different levels of the spine in a pretty isolated and precise way. And I've been thinking about that idea of the multifidi and how sometimes they can get sleepy and be less stabilizing for the back. And I was just wondering about, in Anna's case, or in somebody's case where they have a tight QL and tight psoas, would activating those muscles, getting them kind of woken up and supporting, would that help with allowing those other muscles to release some?
Yes. So in theory, if the problem is coming from Anna's back, sorry, we keep picking on you. If the problem is coming from her back and you go in and you strengthen those the multifidi and the intertransversary and the interspinalis muscles, and you strengthen those, she might get some relief in her back. If the problem of her tight QL and psoas is because of her hip and you stabilize her back, will she get some relief? Maybe. Is it going to solve her real problem? Probably not. But will it give her some relief? Maybe, yeah. I mean, it'd definitely be worth a try. You wouldn't be hurting her by doing that. And my assumption is that there's small motions, right? There's small motions that take a lot of thought and precise movement. So I think it cannot hurt. But will it solve the problem? If the problem's in her back, maybe there's a really good chance that it would help solve that problem. If the problem and the reason she's gripping is because it's somewhere else in her body, it may not solve the problem. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
This is also another little tangent, but slightly related to what you were saying when you were saying about athletes. So, there are all of these different Pilates. They're not really Pilates, but there's, Pilates that's more focused on form and stabilization. I think more what we do. And then there's these other like Body Rock, Pilates Pro Works, Megaformer, like just kill the body, kind of what you're talking about with the athlete that wants to do that work of just busting their body up and having really big muscles. And then there's that other work of the stabilization that you have to do subtly to support. So would you say for those people that are just doing that kind of overly aggressive, superficial muscle work, that it would be great to balance that out? I mean, they're just two different works that a body needs, just like muscle needs contraction, elongation. A muscle needs hard work, maybe superficially, as well as deeper stabilization. Would that be a way that you would explain to these people who just want to kill their muscles, like you were saying to that athlete, that they're just very different beast and you need both of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good, the way that I tend to explain, I think that's a good way to explain it. What I tend to say is, it's kind of my new favorite, one of my new favorite phrases is small muscles, small work, big muscles, big work. Like you want big muscle work, you're going to do big muscle exercises. You're going to go run up a mountain. You're going to do power squats. You're going to do, crazy stuff. You want big muscle strength. That's what you're going to go for. You want small muscle strength. You need to do small movements and get those big muscles out of your way. Because as soon as you go for a big movement, that big muscle is going to kick in. But the problem is convincing them that they actually need the small muscle stuff to put in the time to do that work. So I tend to explain it as, if you want stability in this exercise, you need to work those small muscles. You want to prevent injury, you need to work those small muscles because they are what actually hold your structure together. Yeah. So do I lose athletes? I just lost one, I think. After one visit, I think I lost her and I could see it on her face. And I was thinking the whole time, I'm like, how do I convince this woman that she really needs to slow down? Or is she going to come crawling back in 6 months when she just cannot move anymore? And then she'll listen. Then she'll have the ears to hear what I have to say. And I think that's what's going to happen. I think I'm going to see her in 6 months, or she'll go to everybody else first and she'll end up back at somebody like me or you. And then because she can't do what she wants to do anymore. She's to the point where she shouldn't be doing it and it's hurting her and she's still doing it. But she didn't want to hear me. So she didn't want that information. And so, it's a hard, yeah, go ahead, Lorraine.
So just to kind of sum it up, hypermobile people may have tight muscles, they may have loose muscles, but their ligaments are probably loose.
Their ligaments are too long.
Too long. And what about the tendons?
The tendons, so the muscle tendon is long, but that really isn't so much of the problem, because you can have, and this is where like we get people on all of this spectrum, right? I think it really does depend on, so muscle tendon isn't as much of a problem because we can strengthen a muscle. And by strengthening a muscle, we can actually put some tension on that tendon and kind of approximate using that muscle. It's the things that are held together by ligaments only. So the joint capsule, the ligaments that surround the knee, what else am I thinking? All the little ligaments that hold your discs in place. So posterior longitudinal ligament and ligamentum flavum at the back of the spine, holding those discs in place, right? All those are loose. And while there's muscles surrounding, it takes a lot of work to strengthen. I mean, imagine, okay, think about your feet. We talked when we did that foot module ages ago, right? I was talking about how there's tiny muscles in the bottom of your foot that actually, if we put the work in, we could all walk around barefoot on uneven surfaces and never need any help or support or shoes, really, if we put the work in. How many people are willing to put that much work in, though? It takes work to strengthen those little tiny muscles, and it's boring, tedious, standing on balls and standing on uneven balance wobble things under your feet all day and walking on your tip. Like, it takes constant work. And imagine if you have to do that to your whole body. So yes, that's the problem, is that those ligaments aren't holding. It's a lot of work to use the muscles in their place, but everybody needs that stability. This is where when things go wrong, everybody, not just hypermobile people. So can you actually fix a shoulder by doing rotator cuff exercises? Yeah, anybody's shoulder. Can you put seat a hip better with hip exercise? Yes, go ahead, Lane.
I'm curious about Anna. I came in a little late. I'm sorry. I had a dental appointment. Is this current? Your psoas and QL current?
Yeah, just briefly, post first hip replacement left side, or pre and post left side replacement, right side had always been tight in that chain of trigger points from my neck to my lower back, and then stayed that way. And then after right hip replacement, it was the same. And then several months after my back went out in July, it shifted to my traditional from my 20s lower left that I always had. So now I have lower left instead of right. And it's from Zeina QL. And so as they're definitely holding on, and that side's a little shorter, and I've got a little bit of scoliotic stuff. That hip, that I have an anterior tilt, which is making, yeah. So it just, the problem is for me was it shifted, and it shifted to where I initially had problem for 2 decades through my career, freaked me out because I had gotten used to the new normal on the right side. And it was like, what's going on here? And I have an MRI scheduled update and a appointment possibly with Aurora. I don't know if you guys know Aurora. Yeah, he was a PT and now he's an orthopedic surgeon. So he definitely brings his PT-ness to non-surgical awareness as much as possible. He's a Marin general.
So with that, Zeina, I'm curious if the ligaments are holding her poor joints together that have now been remodeled, because now she can actually get a leg up under her hip where she couldn't before because of the dysplasia. What's going on with the ligaments in a hip replacement? Right. I mean, because I'm dealing with people who have knees, not so much, knee problems, not so much, but hip replacements are a little bit trickier in terms of the stuff around. It's not a simple hinge joint. So I'm curious about ligaments in a hip replacement.
I'd have to look and see. I think they definitely have to cut through the capsule and dislocate the hip, right? So we're cutting through a ligamentous capsule in somebody who already doesn't have a ton of stability. Does that come back together? No. Does the ligament really come back together? No. Should technically the musculature in the direction of that anterior hip replacement, should the musculature be able to support the lack of capsular stability? Yeah, most people, absolutely, yes. Do we know what it's going to do in a hypermobile person? Not as well. Is it going to probably be more of a challenge? Yes. And so I think what she needs to do, same with Jill that we saw on the video, right? She had an anterior hip replacement. She's struggling a bit as well with, in her case, it's not in her back, but it's really psoas over tightness and scarring and stuff in the front that's keeping her from being able to walk properly on that leg and to get the everything not sorted out, everything stacked properly over that leg, because what little stability was there was also taken away a little bit. So a little bit of the little stability is gone after that surgery. And there's always, if you remember from our little lecture, it takes longer for any healing to take place in somebody who's hypermobile, especially if it's affecting their skin at all. So it's a longer process. And I think in Anna's case, she resolved the problem of the hips, the joints. And so she's left back with, okay, so before all these hip issues really kicked in, I had this back thing going on. So maybe we need to go back to Chris now and ask Chris to help you figure out how to isolate movements in your spine and see if that actually does do something for you. Yeah. So I hope that makes sense. I know it's kind of a foggy, yeah. Because this was your original problem. So it's actually a really good sign. Tells me that your hips are healthy. But now we're back at, okay, now what do we do? So, but yeah, maybe then those intrinsic strengthening exercises are key. I mean, and I know you do a ton of work already, so it's not that I think you don't, but maybe a different way, a new way for your body to learn. Something that you have to learn new is always interesting because you don't have a set pattern for it.
Well, and
So
also
you won't.
what Zaina's really helps me with is that I actually have to fight my inclination to work hard, and I have to really do when I'm doing less than 50%, I'm actually on the right trajectory. And when I do more than 50%, I might be putting my joint in a new place or doing other stuff. So for me, literally less is more, because I can really get myself into a pickle or in the wrong position in my joints if I don't do less is more. So I think that's a really helpful thing if you have a very able-bodied, hypermobile person that's trying to fix it by working harder, they're actually shooting themselves in the foot. And Zeina has been really key to having me understand that I can't solve it by just working harder. I have to work completely differently, which is working like I feel like I'm not working, which is really hard.
Mhm. Yeah. And that's why I lost that client, because I told her she had to work less, not more. And she was like, what do you mean? How can I work less? I've been working hard. I'm working really hard on this. And I go, is it working? And she just looked at me and I was like, okay, she's never coming back. I mean, I didn't know how I did. It was in my kindest, nicest way trying to tell her, but so go ahead. I think somebody else had a question.
Yeah, I do. So I'm thinking about Anna's QL and psoas and what Chris was saying about the multifidi and the balancers in the spine. And it occurs to me that, yeah, maybe the concentration on that localized hip and the muscles that are affecting the hip per se can be throwing off, because she's hypermobile everywhere, right? Not just hypermobile in one joint. So that's kind of my question hidden in there. Is hypermobility spread out evenly in all ligaments? Is it individually because maybe you work more on one that you stretch that one more, but is it a generalized, like if you had a little baby wasn't moving and didn't work, and then you tested all the ligaments and they got, yeah, they're all loose, but then you start walking and start doing and you tighten some and keep others loose? Is that kind of how it goes on?
So that's an amazing question. And it really is. And there's no short answer. Here's as short of a summary as I can give you. If somebody falls and dislocates their shoulder, that shoulder becomes hypermobile. It doesn't matter if they're hypermobile before or after. The chances of somebody dislocating their shoulder a second time are about 50%. A third time after that second time is like 90% sure they're going to dislocate that shoulder again. That shoulder is hypermobile. That person in that joint is hypermobile. Does that mean they're hypermobile in every other joint in their body? Not like that shoulder. But if that shoulder easily dislocated, like if they had a hard hit and fall and dislocated, that might be hypermobility due to injury in a particular joint in the body. But if they dislocate that shoulder, like I have this young guy, dislocated one shoulder, had to have 3 times, had to have surgery, came back and saw me this last summer, dislocated the other one. Is that guy dislocating the first shoulder because it was a really hard hit on that shoulder? That's what we thought. That's what we hoped. But no, somebody else who had the same hit that he had on that shoulder wouldn't have dislocated. Now we know for sure because the other one's dislocating. Right. So he's hypermobile in multiple joints. So so generally, if somebody is hypermobile and we do that testing for the hypermobility and you see that they meet a lot of those markers, right? Those 9 points, if they're meeting a lot of those points, that means they're probably generally hypermobile, because we're looking at elbows, knees, thumbs, hands, forward bending, which is hamstrings, spine. So we're looking at a lot of areas and giving them a score based on that. So if we are testing for hypermobility in general, we would see if that actually exists. And that's something that you could actually do in your studio just as an informative tool for yourself. I can do it as a PT, but I actually can't even give them a diagnosis even if I see it. all those points, but I can do the test. They can do it themselves, which is why you can do it. You can say, hey, can you do this? Let me see what happens when you extend your elbows. What happens when you extend your knees? Can you bend forward and just flat hands on the ground? So they can do it, which is why you can do it, and have an idea and say, hey, has anybody ever tested you for hypermobility? Right. And that would be the conclusion, but you give you an idea. So that would give you an idea of whether it's a general issue for this person, or if it could be a one joint off, like maybe they sprained one ankle, had an accident, sprained it, and then it kept spraining. But it's only ever that one ankle, never the other, never a shoulder, never a hand, then you might go, okay, that ankle is now hypermobile due to injury. Not that they're necessarily hypermobile everywhere. And yeah.
It speaks a little bit to what we're talking about, of the thinking of these young Chinese gymnasts and Russian ballerinas, that they have the children that they aggressively overstretch, and then they end up being, what they want, which is very mobile and able to do everything. But it's not necessarily that those kids would have been hypermobile, but they at a young age have been stretched into that mobility, or they could never be stretched into that mobility if they weren't going to be hypermobile. Do you know what I mean?
Right. So that's another super interesting question. And I trained with Chinese acrobats, and I will speak from that point. They select the kids at a young age that they put into the different categories of the acrobatics. So for example, if they have a kid who's hypermobile looking as a kid, that's the contortionist. And then they train them. If they have a kid who's really strong and has, like my Chinese acrobatics coach, I didn't start doing Chinese acrobatics till I was in my 20s. And he took one look at me, one of the coaches, and looked at my arms and looked at me trying to handstand. And he said, you would never have been selected to do handstands. Why even bother? That's what he told me. And I was like, I'll just find myself a new coach then, but that's the mentality, right? So if there's a hypermobile kid and they're not doing contortion, they're not going to be selected for handstands, because they have the wrong anatomy for that. So they're selecting those kids, but yes, then they take those kids and they train them. So they become more so hypermobile. Is that a good or a not good? I don't know. I need a long-term study on contortionists. I've always said since I was doing circus and before I became a PT, while I was studying pre-PT school, I was like, somebody needs to do a long-term study on contortionists. I want to know what happens when they're 60. So it'd be really interesting to see, because the minute they get weak, they fall apart, is my opinion. But yeah.
So staying on the same topic around what occurs to me is in your Growing Tall workshops, in all your Growing Tall workshops, my awareness is that I am not engaging one muscle specifically on one joint. I'm engaging the whole system that pulls my skeleton together and holds the skeleton up standing. So that to me seems like a really good methodology for hypermobile people, because you're not just focusing on one joint or one area. You are engaging that joint possibly. Now I can't figure out how to do psoas and QL while growing taller, maybe firing the butt, maybe firing the quad, maybe that's a method to think about. It's primal for your hypermobile people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's, yes. Here's why that growing taller is so important to me, because it puts your body together, it zips you up, right? The idea is that we contain and then we move from that contained place rather than moving and then trying to contain. Right? And we can contain from our center line. So it could be the center line center this way, but it could be my center line this way. So if my arm and leg are moving away from each other, that center line becomes this going this way. Yeah. And that's on my back doing all our Pilates ab exercises. So if we can contain, it then allows for movement. If there's no containment, I cannot move, I can't have any force or any power, any control over those movements outside of my contained zone. So if I'm out there, you see these kids, like, I don't know if you watch kid athletes, you see them, they're like wet noodles, and you wonder how they're kicking a soccer ball, how they're running down it. They're like wiggling, losing so much power and efficiency in their movement. Gymnasts, dancers, ice skaters. Now I'm watching all these ice skating kids. I'm like, oh dear God, can someone please glue them together? You know, like, so in the growing taller, that's really that zipping up, growing, lengthening. And the other piece that's really important to keep in mind, right? And I actually told this to Jill this week when we met yesterday. I said, Jill, if you have to think about how you're going to place, how you're going to activate your deep abdominal here, when you take a step forward, to take the step forward and actually plant over that leg, if you have to tell yourself to do that, it's already too late. Your foot's hit the ground, you've already moved through that step. By the time you tell yourself what you have to do, the moment's passed. Unless you're going like snail pace slow, I can then think about, okay, this, and come over and go. So you cannot be walking around in space thinking about that very minute detail of the movement, how you're going to place it. It has to happen naturally without you telling yourself to do it. It has to become the pattern. So if you use that pattern in every motion, if I zip up for every motion and I connect through the whole body every time I take a motion, I'm training my body to do that no matter what position I'm in. And that becomes my movement pattern. Yeah, Anna.
I think to Zeina, speaking to Lane's point, yes, that's great to put it all together. But like we were seeing with Jill, there may be a piece that doesn't want to be put together, like the shoulder or the inner thigh clapping together and not turning on the right muscles. So then you have to go piecemeal, right? Is that
right? Then you're learning to play the piano, or you're learning a dance choreography and you're trying to figure it out step by step, right? So that you do that practice in super slow motion, but to expect that somebody, and you do that meticulously. I mean, Laith and Ola, they sit there, slow the music way down, and they take one step after the other, and they're working on this hip lifting, this ab pulling in, this hip rolling through, this, now my weight's over here, now I point the foot, now I draw, right? They're going in snail pace slow to train their bodies to do that motion so they can do it without having to tell their body what to do. It becomes the pattern of motion. So yes, we break it down, we can break it down, but they can't break it down and expect to walk around the world that way until it becomes that part of them. But then I think staying isolated forever, like there are Pilates classes and teachers, and there are physical therapists that is all they do is break it down. And they never put it together and put it in bigger motion. It never, in my opinion, will never be functional then. You have to, at some point, you have to move through space, and you have to be able to translate that action into real movement in space. And I don't know, playing an instrument, Lorraine, perhaps you do this, learning a new song or trying out new, more difficult chords, right? I don't know how it is for you, but when I get down to that piano and I start reading this new song, sometimes it's not that I can't read the music fast enough, it's that my fingers actually aren't doing what I want them to do fast enough to get the song faster. Like I have to spend time working on the coordination of what's happening with my hands slowly so that then I can play it faster, right? It's the same thing. That's what you'd strive to, but you also need to try playing it faster or you'll never get faster. You won't ever have that pattern. Yeah. Go ahead, Chris.
I was working with a woman who's very mobile, hypermobile, and she was talking to me about how and she's in her 60s, but she's very fit and she's danced all of her life. And she was talking about how when she dances, she, like everything comes together, and she's not sort of thinking piece, 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 piece. And what I was noticing as I was working with her was she had so much facility and so much sensitivity to her body that she could, like, she's like, oh, I feel this here, I feel that here, I can move this, I can move that. And there was this sort of the amount of energy that was going into having to kind of put all of these pieces together seemed tremendous. And so we were talking a little bit about, you know, how do you find that trust in your body that you have when you are kind of doing this activity that your body knows really well? I was thinking about Andrea as well. And so it seems like that breaking down is important, because it's, you know, you do need to address the patterns in different parts of the body, but that getting to that place of trust in your movement is also really important.
Yeah. And so this is where we come to tricking them into getting into the right place. So if she can do it dancing, she can do it. So how do we, without her having to go too mentally into it, how do we make her body do what we want it to do? And that's the puzzle, right? I need to take her. I could see it when she's dancing. What am I seeing when she's dancing and moving? That what is she doing that I can then take her and make her do that in another position, in a daily activity, in a step up a stair, in a how to, like, what is that? And helping that person find it. So this is where putting somebody, like, I'm just going to make it up, right? She dances beautifully. She can't walk up a stair without hurting in her sacrum. But you know that when she's dancing and she's lifting one leg, like, that's no different than walking up a stair, because she's not only lifting that leg, right? She's squatting while she's doing it. So I can do this, no problem, but I can't walk my butt up a stair without hurting. What? So something she's doing in that, I need to recreate having her walk up a stair. So I can isolate that walk up a stair by laying her down on a reformer, supporting her entire spine that way, putting one leg under the bar, one leg on the bar, and teach her how to press with one leg without moving any. Well, she's kind of strapped down on that reformer. You have the feedback of that. She's going to press out with one leg until she doesn't have pain pressing out on that one leg. We figured out where that body is. Then we take her right off that reformer and we put her on the chair and have her press down. Tell her it's the same thing. Now you're pressing down on the chair. Great. Now let's go walk up the stair. But you find what it is that does work, and you take that and you have to apply it back to something that's not working. And that's the puzzle, right? And that's where, you know, like, it's so helpful for me, like with Andrea, for example. I watch her dance across that floor and I go, what do you mean you can't do an upper ab curl? Look what you can do on that dance floor. What are you doing when you're upper ab curling? You know, like, what is that to you? That is not the same thing. Because if it was, you'd be able to upper ab curl, because you're definitely using those muscles on the dance floor, right? To move your rib cage over and to move back and to do all kinds, like, you should see her hip motion. And it's controlled and it's beautiful. What? She can't do an upper ab curl? Those abs are working. How do I recreate that in a different functional way so she can bend over and pick up her dog when she needs to? Or, yeah. Go ahead, Emma.
Just a thing that's been really helping me lately, and I don't know if it would help anybody you guys are working with, is that idea of what we were talking about, how you can't go piecemeal, super buto, small and slow forever is doing. But for me, what's like, for example, sleeper or side footwork, because I've been trying to figure out where my knee is, because my knee is all over with my hip, is to do it really, really, really super slow. And then to just be like, okay, there's my knee. And then I just like make myself go at a faster tempo, just really awareness of the chain. So that tempo shift has been helping me, because you do have to let go of a certain amount of stuff. Like we said, you have to function, it has to be functional. but allowing myself to be like, okay, I'm going to reflect for a moment. I'm going to do 5 really super slow. I'm going to feel what I feel. And then I'm just be like, okay, you got to freaking do it now. And then just kind of making my brain and my body figure it out a little quick. That pattern of going slow, fast for me has been helping me. Just a thought, just kind of what we were talking about.
Yeah. And I would have to say that that does work for some people on the hypermobile spectrum. For the Lynn's on the hypermobile spectrum, that would not work. She was so far gone by the time that she would have just fallen completely apart. She would be able to do it if we went fast at first, but now she's there. So if it's somebody that far along the path, hopefully they're also working with other people. It becomes that team effort we were talking about. But with your amount of awareness too, and you knowing what is actually going to hurt you, and you understanding some of that anatomy too, you can maybe, speaking for you, but you can tell yourself, okay, I could do this slow. I've done what I can slow. Now I'm going to power so I get some other muscle work. And I know anatomically that I'm in this 4-4. So what actually could go wrong? Something maybe, but not a lot, not something that's going to set me back.
It's also a little bit of just like what we were talking about, the trust of, because I think with hypermobility, you can get, and Zeina, we talked about this, like I was trying to control my back pain walking by hunkering down on my abs and not breathing through my ribs. And that didn't work, and just locking. So in a way, it's me going, okay, I trust you, body, to do this, and I'm not going to be micromanaging. So it's almost a mental for me. And again, I am a more able-bodied person with a lot of awareness, but there's this whole mental piece of it that is really hard, because you don't trust your body in a certain way. And to regain some of that trust by saying, okay, we did this slow, and you got it, you can do it. And then just kind of going safely. And I'm doing side footwork. I'm not like jumping off a building. But it's a leap of faith for me to let myself be less controlled, to not be so controlling mentally and physically, because that control, like I said, I can lock stuff down, and in my hypermobility, the lock doesn't always solve the problem. It can make the problem worse.